Hey everybody, it's Abishur Prakash here, or Mr. Geopolitics. The world is on fire after Trump has threatened to put 50% tariffs on top of the Liberation Day tariffs on all Chinese imports after China retaliated with 34% tariffs on all US imports. This is a turning point for the world, for the global economy, for geopolitics. This is not a tariff war the way some are interpreting it, some are presenting this. This is the start of a US-China economic war, the likes of which the world has not seen in modern history. The world's two largest economies, the United States and China, are now locked in a holistic economic war that will affect the entire world. This is how what's taking place needs to be interpreted. This is the real fight, the real status, the real stakes between Washington and Beijing and every other global capital and global business. This is the new landscape the world is entering. There's no other way to put this. And because of this, China is not going to retaliate by banning the next Avatar film or other Hollywood movies, even if that is what happens in the short term. I will get to what China's retaliation could look like later in this video. But for now, China is also aware that this is a new kind of fight, a new kind of competition, and this isn't just about tariffs anymore. So before I get into what's going to happen, what all of this means, I want to explain why this point in time is different than other points in time when the US and China have collided, like during Trump's first term or even during the pandemic when China was viewed as persona non grata by the West. And in many ways, that perception hasn't recovered even in the post-pandemic world. So what makes this situation different? Why is this situation an economic war, not just a tariff war or a trade fight where the old status quo could return at any moment? There are a few reasons why. The first is that the Chinese psyche has completely shifted. And I've said this before, that China is no longer willing to bite its tongue, stay quiet, approach the US purely through the lens of negotiation, and capitulate no matter what happens from the other side, no matter what the other side does. In this case, the United States. China has changed gears and is now ready to strike back. What China has done with controlling the flow of rare earths, what China has done with its industry groups sounding the alarm on American exports and American goods like chips, what China is doing across the world. For example, its mega port in Peru, which isn't getting enough attention, but is a sign that the Chinese footprint has spread directly in the US backyard in ways that goes beyond, let's say, nearshoring like in Mexico. So China is not going to stay quiet. The Chinese have made this clear, both through its actions and through comments that are being purposefully made, like the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying it's ready for any type of war, be it trade, economic, or other. China is no longer going to stay quiet. China views this as crossing its own geoeconomic red lines, and China is prepared to swing and get bloody. So this is not just about tariffs or trade. This is about the holistic change in China's approach. Second, again to do with China, is that China cannot afford to simply dance or capitulate or play nice. The Chinese economy is in its weakest position and point in a long time. FDI in China is down 99% over 3 years. 99%. China's business creation, the number of companies, especially strategic companies in strategic sectors, is down to historical lows. The Chinese business exodus is picking up, particularly in Hong Kong. So the Chinese integration with the Western economic world is changing in permanent ways, and China's economy is feeling the pain. So China cannot afford to stay quiet when it's hit with 104% tariffs on all Chinese exports to America. That's simply not on the table. The third is that America is becoming aware that China is not playing by the rules, and China is behaving in ways that challenge the American geoeconomic footprint. And Washington has been aware of this for some time now, but there's two ways America is now dealing with this. The first is accepting that a new form of globalization has begun, vertical globalization, what I call the vertical world, where nations are creating walls and barriers, technological, ideological, economic, geopolitical, between one another. And this is resulting in less integration between economies, more disorder, more separation, more tensions, and more feeling like the other, the foreign side, the other side, is not complementing me, but is clashing and competing with me. So vertical globalization is taking off. America is very clear-eyed about this. And because vertical globalization is taking off, the idea of the US and China holding hands indefinitely is dead. Both the Americans and Chinese are aware that the world is splitting up, fragmenting, and because of vertical globalization, because there is now more separation than unity, both sides are willing to and ready to swing in ways that wouldn't have been possible when the old era of globalization was flourishing. The last point, also connected to the US and also connected to how America is interpreting what's taking place in the world, is that America First is now being seen for what it really is. It's not just about tariffs, immigration, fentanyl. That was the old America First during Trump's first term. What I talked about in my video, what America First really means, at its core, America is accepting that the world order that America built after the Second World War is no longer working for it, whether it's free trade has been hijacked from China, security commitments, Americans are asking why? Why should I care about protecting Europe? Everything else from global integration, where Americans are questioning whether ideology even allows global integration to take place, or even alliances and diplomacy. Is diplomacy still alive and well in today's world, even though the institutions that underpin diplomacy were built by America? All of this is leading America to create something brand new. So America First is about America building a new set of systems, a new landscape that puts America first, and in the process means America is willing to walk by and walk away from its old allies and alliances. And in the process, it means America is willing to clash with its main adversaries in ways that wouldn't have been possible in the past, would have seemed incredibly outlandish. So this is the new status quo of America thinking, and the new status quo of the Chinese thinking. But particularly with America, it's willing to do things because the old order that it built is no longer important to it. It's leaving that old world order behind and is moving towards something brand new. And in that outlook, colliding with China is not a question of whether it's the right choice, but in many ways, from Washington's vantage point, it's the only move, because the Chinese have reached such a point in terms of their economic growth, their economic power, and their geoeconomic footprint that collision is the only option on the table. So those are some of the main reasons why this is an economic war, not just a tariff war, not just a trade war. At the core of what I'm saying is that the psyche of governments, specifically the US and China, has completely changed. These governments are no longer looking at each other the way they once did, because not only has their psyche and wiring changed, but the terrain that they're standing on has completely shifted too. So this is the start of a new kind of confrontation. What I am looking and viewing it as is that it's an economic war that will fundamentally change how the world works. So that's what makes this situation different. So the next question is, what does this mean? What does this mean for the world if the US and China are locked in an economic war? And there are many things. This means many things for global companies, for governments, for institutions, for global stakeholders. let me touch on a few key points. The first is that the US and China are on the precipice of a new kind of decoupling. Before Trump became president for a second time, decoupling was replaced with de-risking. De-risking was what the West unveiled in the last stages of the pandemic at the G7 in Tokyo. The West unveiled de-risking, where the West would unplug from China in strategic battlefields, be it EVs, be it chips, be it critical resources. Instead of decoupling, it was de-risking. Now de-risking is dead and decoupling is back in full force with a vengeance. And the US-China economic war is going to cause a new kind of decoupling, holistic decoupling between the US and China on a scale the world has not seen. So in order to deal with the chaos that's unfolding, global stakeholders should be looking at what's happening in this economic war from the lens of decoupling, not tariffs, not de-risking, not some momentary flare-up where the old economic relationship will return. This is now the US and Chinese economies truly unplugging from one another in ways that would have seemed impossible just a short time ago. So that's the first way to interpret what's happening. The second way is that two very different geopolitical orders are now forming for the world. The US and China have been dancing together now for decades. There has been a lot of fears of the world breaking up into a US camp and a Chinese camp. A lot of those fears seem to disappear because of globalization, or were put on hold because even if globalization was breaking down, it was going to break down at a very slow clip, and global trade would remain intact for the foreseeable future. None of that is now happening. All of that has been shot. All of those beliefs and assumptions now no longer hold up. We are at the precipice in this new economic war of two very different geopolitical orders emerging, one led by the US and one led by the Chinese. And at least two geopolitical orders will emerge because there's also the Europeans, the Arabs, and the Indians, all of whom have their own outlook and desires and positions. But vis-a-vis the US and China, this is the start of the world truly breaking up, of the world truly becoming vertical in many ways. The US is going to try and push countries in one direction, and the Chinese are going to try and push countries in one direction, because whatever links kept the US and China together have been severed and are being severed at record speed. There is now nothing, there's no aspect of the US-China relationship where Washington and Beijing are seeing eye to eye. From technology to climate to diplomacy to even how to end the wars in Europe or the Middle East, the US and China are completely opposing one another. There's no area where they're on the same page. And in such a status quo, the only possibility, the only direction is divergence, is the US and China truly moving in two different directions and with two different strategies that at the end collide with one another. So two different geopolitical orders are now forming that will force everybody to pick a camp. And that's the third point that needs to be made, which is the era of geopolitical neutrality is ending. The US and China economic war will force everybody, from governments to businesses to institutions, to pick sides. Even those that pride themselves on neutrality, on non-alignment, whether it's businesses who have tried to stay out of geopolitics and are trying to please as many different camps of nations as they can, whether it's governments that have built their own geoeconomic strategy that revolves around neutrality and non-alignment, the space for neutrality and non-alignment is disappearing. And the US-China economic war is going to force everybody to choose one superpower over another. And there are possibilities for, as I said before, other geopolitical orders to emerge. But in the short term, nations will have to choose a camp. And whether it's America or China, whatever camp they choose will change the destiny and fate of those countries. Those countries can't operate with the same economic design if they've aligned themselves with the US, and they can't operate with the same economic design if they've aligned themselves with China. And this becomes particularly tricky for certain parts of the world, for example, Southeast Asia, which has tried to win and gain and use the US-China fight to its advantage by becoming hubs for supply chains, foreign investment from companies that are trying to maintain their neutral stance. But if neutrality is gone, and companies and countries are now picking sides, which also means a lot of capital moving back to the US economy because nations and companies are aligning with Washington, then the ability of these countries like Southeast Asia, for example, to offer themselves as neutral hubs, as neutral epicenters diminishes. The role of these economies fundamentally changes and new question marks form on the top of these capitals. Of course, there is much more, but these are three main points in terms of what does this mean. And the last part is, so if the US and China are locked in an economic war, where will this lead to? What happens next? There are hundreds of consequences, of scenarios, of shockwaves that global stakeholders need to be aware of. Let me discuss two of them in detail. The first is for the Chinese. What will China do? As I said at the beginning of this video, China may retaliate in the short term by banning the imports of US films, by raising prices on US agriculture, by investigating how American companies access the intellectual property of Chinese companies, which basically means EVs and China's green sector. But this is not how Beijing is going to retaliate in the long term to a US-China economic war, and today to the US imposing 104% tariffs on Chinese imports, a figure that could rise at any moment if China refuses to heed Trump's next demands. So we could be at the beginning, as crazy as that sounds, of Trump's tariff against China. 104% could be just the beginning. So if in China, the sentiment is an economic war has begun, one of the ways the Chinese may retaliate is by leveraging its debt in the developing world. A lot of folks have been concerned about this so-called debt trap diplomacy, but few have been able to define what this might look like. What could this actually materialize into? And what this could materialize into is the Chinese forcing countries that owe Beijing huge amounts of debt, signing new conditions that favor Chinese imports and the Chinese economy over the American economy. So, for example, China could force certain countries in Africa to give the Chinese the exclusive access to export EVs, meaning only Chinese EVs might be sold in that economy. This could be multiplied across multiple geographies, across multiple regions, and all of a sudden, in this US-China economic war, America gets locked out of certain parts of the world. So that's one way the Chinese could respond. One way the Americans may respond, considering the Chinese are not capitulating, the Chinese are not bending the knee, the Chinese are ready to swing and get bloody, which means America is also ready to swing and get bloody, is by rescinding the Chinese special trade status that was given to the Chinese almost 2 decades ago, that has helped the Chinese tremendously in terms of access to the US economy. This has been on the table for some time now, but this has been considered a nuclear card, that if the US rescinds China's special trade status, then the US and China would be in the midst of an economic war. Except that's exactly where the US and China find themselves today, at the precipice of an economic war, the likes of which the world has never seen. And if that's already where the US and China find themselves, if American companies are having to fundamentally change their operations and their manufacturing and their logistics, then rescinding China's special trade status could be a lot easier. It could be viewed as a natural progression considering the state of play between Washington and Beijing today. And if that takes place, then not only would the US-China trade relationship enter even more of a free-fall situation, but China's ability to trade with the world would also change too. So that would be considered still for the Chinese crossing a geoeconomic red line. And that's just two ways that this fight could go. As I said, there are dozens, if not hundreds of different directions and scenarios and consequences that every global stakeholder has to be aware of, has to understand as they're navigating this US-China economic war. So this is my thoughts on what's happening. I wanted to get this to you as fast as I could, considering how monumental and significant and historic what's taking place is. We're only at the start of this economic battle, but once again, this is not a tariff fight or a tariff barrage or some kind of tariff skirmish. This is not a casual flare-up between the US and China. This isn't a negotiating tactic by Trump where eventually the US and China will find a middle ground and the romance will reemerge. This is a fundamental change in how the world functions. This is a watershed moment, one of those watershed moments that often make the history books, and we're just at the beginning stages. I hope you resonated with today's video insight. Leave your comments below and talk soon.